participants shared that the K-State Garden Hour series is delightful, informative, and helpful.
8 out of 10 K-State Garden Hour participants reported increasing their physical and/or emotional health through the skills they gained in our webinars.
82% of Kansas Garden Hour participants harvested fresh fruits, vegetables, and herbs they grew with the help of our webinars.
90% of K-State Garden Hour participants reported they used unbiased and research-based information to solve plant and garden problems after participating in our webinars.
Plant heroes wear purple. Discover K-State Garden Hour at ksre-learn.com/K-State Garden Hour and become your own garden's superhero.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We are so glad that you're here with us today. We started this webinar back in 2020, and it has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of this program, we have reached over 50,000 gardeners just like yourselves. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. We appreciate your continued support. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Kelsey Hadisall, and I am the horticulture agent for River Valley District, and I will be your host for the day. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started with our speaker today, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to this presentation. This is where we will be looking for questions at the end of the webinar during our Q&A session. You will see this button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. Click on that and you'll be able to enter your question. Today's webinar is recorded and will be posted on the K-State Garden Hour website. We will typically upload any additional resources related to each topic as well. So if there are links in the chat that you can't get to, they will be on the website. Our moderators today are Dennis Patton and Jason Graves. They will be sharing information throughout the chat during the presentation. They will also help us facilitate the Q&A portion of our webinar. Today's topic is integrating native plants into your home landscape. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sharon Ashworth. She is the Horticulture and Natural Resources Extension Agent for Douglas County. Please give us a few moments here while we transition to the presentation slide.
There. Can everybody see the slides?
You're good to go, Sharon. We got you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, hello, and thank you for joining us here today. This month, as Kelsey mentioned, for Garden Hours, integrating native plants into your home landscape. I'm going to go over some definitions. What does it mean when we talk about native plants? We'll talk about some planting considerations and maintenance, and of course, plant recommendations. Now, the emphasis for this talk is about integrating native plants into your existing landscape. I'm not going to be talking about a wholesale replacement of your lawn or landscape or asking you to replace your favorite ornamental plants. We'll just talk about adding some great natives to your landscape that's going to help support our native insect populations. So let's get started with some definitions. So here are a couple definitions that I like. Most definitions of native plants are a variation on this theme, but there are two things I want you to note about these definitions is they generally have a geographic qualifier, and they also talk about evolution and adaptation. So this first definition here, native plants are defined as those that have evolved and adapted to a specific location and have remained genetically unaltered. On that second definition, a plant species, a native plant species is native to an ecoregion where it has evolved in concert with soils, climate, and fauna and other members of a plant community. So these definitions highlight that plants have evolved and adapted in concert with a set of environmental conditions and species that are unique to a geographic area. So when you talk about natives and talk about natives with people from your own locale or maybe across the country, you should talk about natives along with a geographic qualifier. So there are many plants native to the lower 48 of the US, for example, those plants that were not brought here, introduced to this continent from another continent. They're not from Europe, they're not from Asia. But a particular plant that you're talking about might not specifically be native to the tallgrass prairie ecoregion of Northeast Kansas or the cross timber region of Southeast Kansas or the Western Kansas shortgrass communities. So you always, when you're talking about natives, we're thinking about this sort of evolutionary adaptation to a set of species in a geographic area. So these evolutionary relationships between plants and animals and the environment in a defined region is one of the reasons that people enjoy planting natives. Native plants are going to support a local biodiversity and local ecosystem functions. Of course, another reason people like to plant natives is because they are lower maintenance than a non-native ornamental species. So they're going to be, I make the emphasis here that they are low maintenance plants or generally lower maintenance plants, but they are not no maintenance plants. Our native plants are going to be adapted to our local conditions. We have moisture, heat, cold, the temperatures, plant diseases, pests, which means they're going to be really robust. They're going to be hardy in our environment. They're going to tolerate the heat and the drought. They're going to tolerate the local soil conditions. They're going to resist pests that they've evolved with. They're going to resist diseases that they have evolved with in concert in this ecoregion. So what that means for us is that generally they're going to need a lot less water than a non-native ornamental, and they're not going to need fertilizers and definitely not pesticides. So they are lower maintenance, but and as we'll go through this talk, I'll show you that they are not no maintenance. So, and of course, another reason people plant these natives is they are beautiful, stunning plants to add to your landscape. So how do you determine if a plant is native to your area? Here are two sites that I like to use. One, the Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses, put together by Mike Haddock of K-State. It's a great website. You can type in or search for a common name, a scientific name. You can search for plants by bloom time, by color. And when you click on that species, you can find out if it's native. Here, for example, I have Echinacea pallida. And on the Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses website, you can see that its native habitat is dry, open, rocky sites, and you can find it in the eastern third of Kansas. Another great website to use is the USDA Plants Database, where you can type in the scientific or common name of a plant and go down to county level data. So when it first pops up, you'll get the lower 48 generally, and then you can kind of dial down to the area you're looking for and find out where native populations have been recorded of the species. And you can see that for Echinacea pallida here as well. And so this will tell you that Echinacea pallida is native to about the eastern third of Kansas. So you might have heard the term nativar. So what is a nativar? A nativar is, and this was on the quiz up front, and that what is a nativar is a cultivar of a native plant. Just simply like that, just like any other cultivar you're going to find at a garden center. The nativar is a term that some people use to call what they call a cultivar of a native plant. So I'm going to, for example, highlight Echinacea purpurea. So Echinacea purpurea is a native, that's the purple coneflower, is a common name for that. It's native, technically, E. purpurea is native to Southeast Kansas woodlands, not Northeast Kansas. But you find this readily available in garden centers, and it tolerates some shade better than other Echinacea species. So that's why it's commonly found and commonly used to turn into cultivars. So unlike Echinacea pallida, that's going to be native to the eastern third of Kansas. Echinacea angustifolia is native to central and western Kansas. So when you look at a plant tag in the garden center, you're going to see a number of things. You're going to see, as I've circled here, a common name like coneflower. You might see the genus part of the scientific name, Echinacea, there, but then you're going to have this other name that's in quotations. In this case, we have snow cone, and then in another one, you have white swan here. Now, this is an indication that this is a cultivar of a native plant. If you were to look at a plant tag and see just the straight native species, you would see the genus and the species. So Echinacea purpurea with no other qualifiers on it, and that would be a native species. When you see the genus Echinacea and then one of these names in quotations, you're dealing with a nativar or a cultivar of a native species. So here are some examples of cultivars of Echinacea purpurea. As you can see, there's a variety of colors and there are different flower forms, but all these that you see in the pictures here, these different colors and different forms all came from Echinacea purpurea. So those double flowers back here, so different forms, and the double flowers that you see are extra petals. So there's a lot of debate, a great deal of debate surrounding the benefits and concerns of native plants in place of planting nativars instead of true natives. So I'm going to go through some of the benefits and concerns regarding these cultivars. So first of all, the benefits, when breeders are taking native plants and they're manipulating for certain desirable traits. So color, height, the size and style of the bloom, like those double flowers, disease resistance, size of fruit. And a lot of times these particular cultivars are more readily available in your garden centers. That's one of the advantages of them. And another common manipulation is height. Later on, I'll have some recommendations for some dwarf shrubs. This is something that is beneficial for home gardeners because a lot of our native prairie plants can be really tall and really big out on the prairie. So there's oftentimes an option where you're not really changing the flower form or the flower color. You're just reducing the height of the plant. So some of the concerns that people have about cultivars is that most nativars are clones. So what that means is that all the plants of a particular clone are genetically identical. And this is a potential problem because genetic diversity can be thought of as an insurance policy for the survival of a species. It gives a population of a species some resiliency. So there is a concern when everything is genetically identical, especially if we're dealing with pests and diseases. We want some genetic variability in that population so that the entire population is not decimated. Also, some research has shown that when you change the flower structure, it makes it much more difficult for pollinators. So take, for instance, these double flowers on the Echinacea purpurea. The extra petals actually come from modifying reproductive structures. So what this means is not only is the plant sterile, but it's not producing any pollen for pollinators to harvest. And the nectar that it might be producing is much more difficult for the pollinators to get to with all those extra petals. So that's some concern about those changing the flower structure on those cultivars. Another concern has been brought up about changing the colors of the leaves. So red, purple leaf color is very popular. There are a lot of cultivars that are designed for that. And there is some evidence that might change the leaf chemistry and that it might be less attractive to insect feeding. Now, on one hand, you might think that's good, but we're trying to attract pollinators. We're trying to support pollinators. So we want the insects to eat the plants. But all in all, there's a variety of research to compare pollinator use of non-natives and cultivars and introduced species. And honestly, the results are all over the place. In some of these studies, it has been shown that pollinators prefer the natives. In some of the studies, studies have shown that pollinators prefer the non-natives. And in some cases, the studies show that pollinators prefer the cultivars. So I'm going to highlight just a couple of these research findings. So in this case, out of the Oregon State University, there was a study done comparing native species and their cultivars. And in this case, they studied 7 different plant groups. And in 3 of those plant groups, the pollinators, in this case, bees, preferred the natives over the cultivars. But in 4 of those groups, there really was no difference in terms of visitation by bee pollinators to the plant groups. So that was a natives versus cultivars. In another study, they compared natives versus introduced species. And by introduced, I mean they came from another continent. These are plants from Europe or Asia that were compared to natives. And in this case, what they found was the non-native plants actually complemented the native pollinator-friendly plantings. Specifically, the non-native plants bloomed earlier in the season, and so gave pollinators sort of a head start in that community, in that environment. So they had something to use before the native plants started blooming. So it did help out. But what they did find is that the non-native plants did not support specialist bees. So there's a little bit, while they supported a lot of bees, but not the specialist bees. So these studies that I've highlighted here focus on bees, but there are of course a wider variety of pollinators out there. There's beetles and moths, other sorts of insects, bats, birds that pollinate. So these studies were only focused on bees. So we need to think about other pollinators. Another thing is these studies did not focus on caterpillars, so larval host plants. There have been some studies that have shown that caterpillar abundance is far less in landscapes that are dominated by non-native plants. So we also have to be very cognizant of larval host plants for all those caterpillars out there. So just a visual representation here of the diversity of bees that need support. So when I talk about plants supporting specialist bees, a lot of plants, non-native, native cultivars, introduced species will support pollinators. The advantage that the native species has is they're going to give support for a wider array of pollinators. So when we think about the question of the types of plants we introduce into the landscapes and how they impact our local ecosystems, it's an area of active ongoing research. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of different sorts of results. People need to look at all the different pollinators and come up with better recommendations for what we put in our landscapes. So I bring these points up to suggest that you don't need to get rid of your favorite non-native plants, but if you want to support a greater diversity, a greater array of insects and birds in your landscape, it helps to incorporate some native plants. And overall, here's just one more study that emphasizes the impact that you as an individual can have. When you plant a pollinator-friendly garden, mix of natives and non-natives, you're having a significant impact on supporting pollinators. You can actually make a difference, whether you're in an urban area, as this study shows, or in a rural area. Making that, you're essentially giving refuge to local pollinator populations and local bird populations by planting pollinator gardens. So you can significantly make a difference. So let's talk about incorporating some natives into your landscape. So this is just a picture of part of my backyard where I've got a pollinator habitat going. And what I've done here, I've got non-native over to the left of your screen. I've got a typical autumn joy stone crop here. And next to it, we've got blazing star, some rose verbena, little blue stem. Those are all the ones in the middle there, blazing star, little blue stem, rose verbena are all native. The purple coneflower on to the right is some cultivar, some nativar of a coneflower that I can't remember which one it is. So So this is what I mean by integrating plants into your landscape. You can have a mix of natives and non-natives, and looking to where you have some space to stick a native. Now, here are some common familiar plants that you can find in many local garden centers. So garden centers still, they'll have maybe top 5 types of native plants or nativars or cultivars of native plants, but not much more variety. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about later on, you might have to use through mail order catalogs or through native plant sales. But here are some common ones that you can generally find. So we've got on the upper left, you've got Monarda. In the middle with the butterfly on it, you've got your butterfly milkweed. Of course, there up in the upper right is this, another sort of milkweed, swamp milkweed. We've got some black-eyed Susan, some coneflowers. That lower left is Culver's root. So these are pretty typical plants you can find in garden centers. Now, I want to point out the little icons that I have. If you can see my pointer here, got a little bee icon and a little caterpillar icon. I put these here. These are plants that have been called out by Heather Holmes. Heather Holmes has a book called Pollinators of Native Plants. And the author highlights specialist bees and larval hosts. So I've got here some indicators when I'm talking about a particular plant that shows that it supports a specialist bee or is a larval host for a caterpillar. And I don't want you to forget about grasses. Grasses, like this little blue stem here, grasses and sedges are fabulous additions to your landscape. They really add diversity to the landscape, and they support caterpillar species. Just look at this list of mostly skippers that feed on little blue stem. This comes from the University of Minnesota that did this study. So add some grasses and sedges to your landscape. They're really going to support that caterpillar population. So what are some planting considerations of natives? We have sort of here in Kansas, of course, we're talking about prairie plants. So if you think about the prairie, especially nowadays, you know, the beating sun, it's hot, it's droughty. If you're going to put a plant like that in conditions that are not quite as severe. So you picture your backyard, you've got partial sun because you've got some trees, you've amended the soil, you've added organic matter like you've been told to do by your local extension agent. You're putting that native plant in with cared for plants. So you're taking that plant that's adapted the harsh, sunny, dry, droughty environment, and you're putting it in a more cared for environment. And this is what's going to happen. It's going to flop over. You get some of these taller plants and they're going to grow kind of leggy, and then they're going to flop over, especially if you've got it in partial sun. So a couple tips on this is one, first of all, even though I said they were low maintenance plants, you still need to have the right plant, right place. Just like any plant you're going to plant in your landscape, natives need the right plant, right place. So put those full sun plants in full sun. Another tip is when you have the late summer, fall native perennials, cut them back by 1/3 in June to reduce their height, and that will help out a little bit. So those late summer, fall native perennials, cut them back by 1/3. I'm going to go back to this picture for a minute of my small pollinator garden in my backyard. This garage wall here faces west. So what I've got here is a group of plants that will tolerate, I don't have full sun here. I don't have a full 6-hour sun, but I don't water this area, and they get a heavy dose of afternoon, that bright afternoon sun. So they can handle the Kansas afternoon sun, but they don't get 6 to 8 hours of sun. So if I move further down my garage wall, what you can see here is I tried planting a Coreopsis here, and even though it likes dry and sun, it doesn't get enough sun. Coreopsis really needs that at least 6 hours, if not 8 hours of sun. And so what it's done is it's flopped over. And so I'm actually killing some Bermuda grass here to move that garden out and replant my coreopsis so that it gets more sun. Over on the right here is the catchfly, royal catchfly, that I picked up at a plant sale just because I wasn't thinking about it, thinking I needed to find a place for it, because that's what we do. We pick up plants when we're not quite sure where we're going to put them and then try to find a space. And I did not find the right space for this. In this case, it's getting plenty of sun, but what happens is this is the soil type in this area. It's clay. I've got a drain pipe near here. You know, royal catchfly really prefers more dry, sandy soil. So I'm going to have to either give this plant away or try somewhere else. So right plant, right place. Another thing you need to be cognizant of when introducing native plants to your landscape is whether or not they're aggressive. Like I said, these plants are adapted to this area. They are evolved to grow here. And so some of them grow very, very, very well. So take common milkweed, fabulous pollinator plant. I have this in my garden. It smells amazing. It's covered in all kinds of insects and pollinators, but it is weedy. It will be aggressive. It will pop up everywhere. It's popped up in my vegetable garden. It pops up in my lawn. Now it's easy enough for me to pull because I have a small area. But this is a plant that I would more than likely recommend to somebody put out in sort of the back pasture. If you've got a really large space and you've got kind of a meadow area, this is a great plant for that. Super supportive of the local ecosystem, the local pollinators, but in a neat and tidy home garden, maybe not recommend so much. Wild strawberry, the same way. I'm going to be in, when I get to my list of plants that I'm going to recommend, I do have wild strawberry in there because it is a great thick ground cover in the right conditions. So if it's in a confined area, if you have borders that keep it confined, then you're okay. And if you want a thick ground cover, wild strawberry is good, but be aware that it's very aggressive. Another thing you need to be considerate about is the size. So this is wild senna here. This is one of our demonstration gardens here in Douglas County. We have a pollinator garden that is just fabulous. We can grow all kinds of things. We've got a big area. Wild senna is great for pollinators, but as you can see here, it's quite large. For reference, here's that autumn joy stone crop down in the lower left of that picture. And you can see how quite big this wild senna gets. So be aware of the mature size of the plant that you are choosing. So another thing to be concerned with or consider when you're planting natives is to plant variety. You're trying to support a local ecosystem, local pollinators. You want variety. So you want variety of form. That means the variety of the flower form, the variety of the bloom shape, a variety of color, a variety of bloom time. Ideally, what you want is something blooming from spring through fall. So you want blooming all through the growing season. And then, of course, you want a variety of purpose. And so what I mean for purpose is you need plants for nectar and pollen, and you need host plants for hungry caterpillars and beetles, and then what I call the buffet plants for hungry birds. Birds need caterpillars. Birds need thousands of caterpillars to feed and raise baby birds. So one of the things that we're doing when we're planting native plants is we are providing plants for caterpillars. And those caterpillars are supporting an incredible food web. And those birds are going to need those caterpillars to feed those baby birds. Now, in my part of the world, the top plants that support caterpillars are for the trees are the oak trees. Those are the ones that are going to support the most caterpillars. As for perennial plants, the plants that support the most caterpillars are going to be in the goldenrods and the sunflowers. Support the most caterpillars. So you want to have some of those buffet plants to provide for the food web. So just a reminder that one of the things we're doing when we're doing native plant gardening is we're not gardening just for us and for our own enjoyment. We're gardening for the ecosystem. We're trying to provide a refuge for our native pollinators. So you planted for the insects, let them eat the plants. It's okay, they will recover. They will recover, they'll be fine. And you'll not only have supported the ecosystem and you can just tolerate a little bit of holes here and there. So maintenance, a couple words about maintenance. So do you deadhead spent blooms on native plants? Yes. Now there are a few plants that like to reseed, like the foxgloves and the cardinal flower. So those plants that are reseeding, you don't want to deadhead, but others you can go ahead and deadhead. For fall cleanup, no, generally with native plants, what you want to do is leave those plants standing. So it's particularly the coneflowers and the black-eyed Susans, those seeds going into the fall are a great food source for birds. So leave those standing. Also, overwintering insects love to burrow into the stems of native plants. And if you can see that hole right here, there's some sort of bee that has kind of made its overwintering nest in the stem of that plant there. So go ahead and leave your native plants up in the fall. I'm going to refer to a couple more studies here. Just to say that pollinators respond to high levels of plant species diversity. If you have some room, get some woody vegetation in there. Garden size, the bigger the better. And of course, sun exposure. That's sort of a good recipe for a variety of pollinators. And just a note about costs, buying native plants can be pretty expensive up front, but in the long run, it can be cheaper. So this one study here showed, and this was as it says from the Corn Belt here in the middle of the United States, that conversion to pollinator habitat is less expensive over a 10-year period than a lawn, whether it's self-cared for or contracted care. So just to note that native plants can be expensive up front, but in the long run may save you money. So just a word about your neighbors, or 3 words about your neighbors. Sometimes when you start putting in native plants next to a lawn that looks like this, a landscape that looks like that, people are going to kind of look at you sideways and wonder what you're doing, maybe call what you're planting weeds. So there's 3 things that you can do for that. So 1, create a focal point in your yard. Have a big rock, a bird bath like in these pictures here that gives the eye something to focus on, and then planting your native garden around it. It helps signal that this garden that you are planting is maintained and cared for and it's thought through. So edges, another big thing, edges. So you can look at the edges here. Here we've got some rose verbena. Down here on the bottom, we've got some Retibita or coneflower, and in the back here is prairie dropseed. And it could be quite messy, except for the fact that we have this path here and this edge. It gives it a definition. It tells people that this garden is cared for and managed and maintained. So those are 3 things: focal points, edges. Oh, and the 3rd one was signs. Sometimes if you put a sign up in your yard that says, I'm planting for pollinators, whether it's something you pay for a sign through like Monarch Watch or the National Wildlife Federation, or just a handmade sign telling people what you're doing, that you're supporting the local ecosystem, goes a long way in helping neighbors understand what you're doing. Okay, so now let's go to some plant recommendations. So a caveat or a disclaimer with these recommendations: opinions will vary. So I'm going to urge you all to talk to your local horticulture agent about what will work for your area and your landscape. Everybody's going to have their own opinion about what they like, and what works in your local area is going to be different. So I'm going to try to recommend some species that work around Kansas, but please talk to your local horticulture agent about what will work locally for you. And they've had experience with these plants in your area, so talk to them. So I'm going to cover a few recommendations for each layer of planting. So when you're planting native plants, it's very helpful to start with a ground cover that acts like a green mulch, so you don't have to weed, and then go for your slightly taller plants. And then you would go for even taller plants or shrubs. I'm not going to cover much of that because most of our taller natives are not really suitable for the home landscape, or are better in a larger landscape, sort of out in the back 40 in a meadow. So I'm going to stick with the ground, spend more time on ground covers and those mid-height plants. I've tried to keep my list to those plants that are more well-behaved and are showy, to give you a good start on integrating natives into your landscape. So I'm going to have pictures here in a minute, but this first slide, I'm starting with ground covers. So these are ground covers that I'm recommending for sun to part sun. They're short, so under a foot, and these could do better with a little bit of moisture. So not the really dry. I'll get to that list in a minute, but for now, short ground covers, sun to part sun, and a little bit of moisture. And so on the left here, you can see I've got Kansas native to native-ish. By native-ish, I mean, I've put together a lawns to landscape presentation, so I recommend these as replacements for lawns. So occasionally, especially with a partial sun species, I've borrowed a couple maybe from over in Missouri. So that's what I mean by native-ish. They may be just over the state line, but you know, plants don't know about those kinds of boundaries. So for comparison, over on the right, I have lists what you might typically find in a landscape that are introduced. So if you think about that poll that we had up at the top while we were waiting for the presentation to start, you can see I had in that poll bugleweed. So bugleweed is one of those introduced species, as is other common landscape things that you might see, like I had the peonies and the lilacs, and those are all introduced species. So our native species that can act in those places include pussy toes, wild ginger, the dwarf crested iris, and the roundleaf ragwort. I'm going to highlight this one. See, there's that wild strawberry right here that I recommend as a ground cover, but only if you want to, if you have a space where you can let it go or you keep it contained. So let me show you some pictures here. So I have these pictures kind of put in this framework, mostly because there's a new trend. I don't know how new it is, but over in England, they have something called tapestry lawns or tapestry landscapes. And I'm very intrigued by this idea where they've planted a lot of native plants in replacing their lawns with basically a patchwork tapestry of low growing native ground covers. And I think it's a really neat idea. And I'd like to start experimenting with that here in Douglas County, trying to find examples of ground covers, because people are always calling me about what to plant under a tree because the grass isn't growing. So here are some examples. So you can see there's that wild ginger up in the upper left. If you can see my cursor wiggle around, here's that Pacra obovata, here the groundsel. Got the sedum here over on the upper right. There's the erigeron off to the right. Here's the pussy toes right here in the middle, this white flower. And then over on the lower left is the iris, the cristata. So all short, lovely little plants. I'm going to feature this Pacra obovata here because it's a great little ground cover. This is what I recommend to people who don't want to mow or continue replant grass under their trees. It's a great little evergreen ground cover, and it shoots up a maybe 8-inch flowering stalk. Beautiful yellow flower that was in the previous slide. Spring bloomer. Then you just cut those down after they're all spent, and then you have a nice little ground cover for the rest that you don't need to mow. So my next list is dry plants, underfoot ground covers, and partial shade. So what I've got here are a number of sedges, you'll notice. Once again, I'd like to encourage the introduction of grasses and sedges into your landscape. So because sedges are larval hosts for many, particularly skipper butterflies and moths. So over on the right here, you'll see what is typically found in this environment. When you have dry, part shade, people often recommend vinca and liriope, which is that monkey grass, bishop's hat, and dead nettle. But here are some options here over on the left. So the sedges, as I mentioned, there's that wild strawberry again, but wild petunia is a nice little plant and also is a larval host. And here I'll show you some pictures of these plants. So up on the top left, you'll find that sedges typically have this tufted appearance here. That's the Carex eburnia and Carex albicans. The Carex pennsylvanica down here forms more of a mat, more of a uniform mat. And that's a nice replacement for grass, as well as that Pacra, a nice replacement for grass. Here's that wild strawberry. On lower right is the phlox and then the wild petunias in the upper right. Okay, my next list is dry sun. So you notice these lists are getting a little bit bigger because that's what's native here in most of Kansas. So these low growing, underfoot, dry, full sun species. So here's a list for that. So here are just a couple introduced things that you might put in that environment. But here's a whole list of recommendations. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Talk to your local agent about what you might recommend. What they might recommend in these situations, because there's so many options when we're talking about dry, full sun areas. I will point out once again these pussy toes, which are a great ground cover. I'll show you a picture in a minute. Antenaria neglecta is strictly, that's the Kansas native. Antenaria plantaginifolia is one of those I borrowed over from Missouri. Rose verbena is an excellent, I love this little ground cover. It's a beautiful pink flower, kind of pops up here and there. And I've also recommended down at the bottom here some two grasses, buffalo grass and blue grama grass. Great grasses, particularly if you want to replace some part of your lawn that you keep trying to keep alive through the drought. And here's a picture of some of these plants. I'm going to point out this picture in the middle here. That's the pussy toes there. This is the plantaginifolia. I recommend it because this is kind of a part shade of my garden. Back here, I've got a pulmonaria right here in front, and I've got a just clematis in the back here. And I just need to fill in, instead of using wood mulch, I use green mulch. I put these pussy toes in there. It's a fabulous ground cover. Here's up in the upper left is that rose verbena. It's a wonderful ground cover, is in sunny locations. And it does tend to move around a bit, but it's always a cheery little pink spot, wherever it moves to. And then down in the lower right-hand corner is a picture of the blue grama grass. Here's just an example of that rose verbena on the left. I'm using as a ground cover and plate as it's taking over from the wood mulch. I've just got it tucked around here from a yucca, around a yucca, and there's that plantaginifolia again. So let's move up from ground covers. I've got some taller species here. They're tall, but they can be tucked into various points of your landscape. Over on the left is a cardinal flower. It's just on the north side of a fence, a little damp area, lower part of the yard. So it seems to do well there. So it's really helpful when you have these sort of odd places to try to match that with some native plants as a great way to integrate native plants into your landscape. Here over in the middle here, I have a big button bush, which can get rather large, but this is a great spot for it. It's the lowest point of my yard. I've got a drain pipe here from the roof. So it's very, very happy here, and it's a great pollinator plant. I'm going to point out I have these asterisks here. These are plants that are going to do well throughout Kansas. If there's no asterisks or the C here, it's mostly eastern Kansas where these plants do well or are native. The button bush here is something that will do well eastern Kansas to central Kansas is where you'll find it native, this button bush. And the same with the rosinweed, eastern to central Kansas. This rosinweed is a great pollinator plant. And I've got along this is a south facing wall. It gets beat to death in the sun. I never water it. I'm always dragging my hose through it. As you can see, I've got my irises in here, which seem to do fine for some reason. And then I've got this rosinweed here. It just does fabulous. Here are some natives up to about 4 feet. And all these will do well central to western Kansas, eastern to all the way to western Kansas. So coneflowers, yarrow, the prairie coneflowers, coreopsis, and of course the blazing stars. The blazing stars are a favorite. I highly recommend those. Some more plants to point out that are some of my favorites. Blue false indigo in the upper left. There's that C again, that shows that it'll go eastern to central Kansas. And then the little specialist like Dahlia purpurea, this purple prairie clover, is a fabulous plant. It does well in most places. And it's not only supports specialist bees, but it's also a larval host. There's the ever popular butterfly milkweed up in the top right of larval host for the monarch caterpillar. Echinacea palace, pale purple coneflower. So it doesn't have it's got support specialist bees. It's something that you'll find mostly in eastern Kansas where it's native. And Heliopsis, this is false sunflower. I didn't have room to put the common name on there. So of course, this is a recorded presentation, so you can always come back and look at these lists. But again, I stress talking to your local horticulture agent for recommendations. Here's just another series. You can see just how beautiful and varied the flower form is on these natives. So putting some of these natives, particularly the ones with these that support larval hosts like golden Alexanders here and support specialist bees, these are just fabulous flowers to add to your garden. Lots of different forms, lots of different blooming times. So take Zizia aurea here down in the bottom left. Talk about this for just a little minute. This flower form, great. It's a bee. I see all kinds of pollinators on this plant. It is an earlier bloomer, which is good, but it's something that I like so much. I've of course tried to plant it in my part sun backyard. And so it tends to do that leaning thing where it's constantly stretching out to get more sun. So I've got to move it out. I've got it sort of on the edge of my yard with a viburnum, and it's just not getting enough sun. So right plant, right place. Zizia is a fabulous thing. So try it out. If it doesn't work, you can move it. I mentioned that a couple slides back, that rosinweed I planted. That's another thing that you'll find it popping up in other parts of your garden, but that's kind of one that you can deal with very easily. You can dig it up, repot it, and give it to a neighbor. So that's something you can do with some of your plants that aren't too aggressive, but maybe spread a little bit. And a couple more flowers here, New England aster and prairie ironweed, of course, fabulous pollinator support there, and specialist bees and larval hosts. One thing about the New England aster, a little tip for that, is the bottom third of it tends to get a little rangy and brown throughout the season. So it's kind of a back of the garden plant. A couple of shrubs I want to recommend. Douglas County Master Gardener Susan Rendell has a fabulous garden, and she has a whole list of 20-something dwarf cultivars of native plants that do well. So if you've got a smaller space and you can't put that really giant button bush in your yard, there's a dwarf variety of it. So I picked these out particularly because these in her list were particularly native to Kansas. So we've got aromatic sumac. That's something that you might be able to put in place of a boxwood. So if your boxwood has bit the dust this year, you might try an aromatic sumac, the grow low version. So because the native version is going to get 5 or more feet tall, whereas the grow low might hang out at 2-3 feet, depending on where you plant it. So dwarf shrubs, and that was one thing I mentioned with the cultivars, is that these are the cultivars where they've adjusted for the height to fit in your garden, but the flower form hasn't changed, the flower color hasn't changed. As far as we know, the leaf chemistry hasn't changed. So they're still going to support pollinators, but be more reasonable for your garden. So that's just sort of a whirlwind trip. There's many more to recommend. So where do you find these native plants? There's a number of resources you can use for native plants. First, you can go to plantnativeks.org. There's a series of publications. One of them is gardening with native plants, kind of what the focus of this talk is. But I've also got landscaping with native plants, reconstructing prairie, restoring prairie, or planting natives around your cropland. It's a whole series. Plantnativeks.org. In this publication, you will find a list of native plant species for your consideration, and also a list of where you can buy plants and seeds. Now, it hasn't been updated in a little bit, so there's probably some more providers out there, but I'm hoping to update that in a little bit. But at this website, you will be able to find a list of native plants that are recommended for home gardens, and also where you can buy them. Also, these great resources for landscaping with native plants. Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses, I've mentioned, fabulous searchable website. The Dick Arboretum down in Heston has a great landscaping page and recommended species. Missouri Botanical Garden has a whole native landscaping essays you can read. These two, Grow Native and the Audubon Plants for Birds database, are searchable databases. All you need to do is type in your zip code and it will come up with a list of natives. And Grow Native, all kinds of perennials. Audubon, of course, is focusing on those plants that are going to support bird populations. But those two are searchable databases. We also have a Kansas Native Plant Society that you can look and find their list. And Johnson County, Kansas Extension has a native plant list as well. And I'm sure my colleagues can put those in the chat for you to access. So just to wrap up before we answer questions. So planting native perennial species are going to support native pollinators and the local food web. It's going to reduce your garden maintenance and costs, and it of course creates beautiful, sustainable gardens. So that's sort of the end message there. So I will end with that, and we have several minutes now for questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks Sharon for all the good information. We do have some questions here we'll try to get through and give you a chance to respond to here. One of the first questions that came up when you were talking about cultivars was, you know, in regards to the seeds and the flowers of those plants, do all cultivars have sterile seeds or even produce pollen? Can you address that question?
Most of the cultivars are going to, depending on what has been manipulated. So a lot of those double flowers that I talked about are not going to have pollen. It's going to be difficult to access the nectar. A lot of them are going to be sterile. Another thing that you need to be concerned is when you have a cultivar, most of those are done by cloning. They're not going to be, you're not going to be able to take the seed from that and reproduce that plant. And even if you were to be able to do that, there's usually a caveat on those that says that you're not allowed to do that because they're proprietary. It's proprietary. People spend a lot of money making those cultivars and they intend to make that money on that, and they're not inclined to for you to be able to plant that and be able to do it for free. So.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that response. A follow-up question to that was regarding pollinators. Do you know if pollinators are adapting to non-natives over time, or do you have any information on that?
That's been the subject of some research papers, but certainly there's no definitive answer to that. It may be the case that there are some adaptations. It might be that what we're talking about is generalist species, generalist pollinators are able to switch. You know, if something is available, they're going to use that. The concern is for those specialist pollinators, where the change in the loss of their habitat and the loss of their species may be happening so fast that they're not able to adapt. They've evolved over thousands and thousands of years with a particular set of plants, and they're not going to be able to adapt as fast if their host plant or their nectar source or the pollen source is disappearing. Excellent. So general species, yes. Specialist species, maybe not so much. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, great. These next few questions kind of delve more into some plant questions. Any advice on, you'd mentioned, you know, some resources on finding some of these plants. We had a person ask about wild strawberries or finding some of these specific plants. Where do we find them?
Well, the best place to find them is if there's any organizations in your locale that have a native plant sale. So that's usually at least here in Douglas County, that's where most of our variety comes from. So we can go to a garden center and we can find some of the top 5, maybe 10 native plant species. So you can start there by asking your local garden center, and they might be able to order some for you, or at least be aware that you're interested in it for next year. So try your garden center, then go, if you've got native plant sales, is a great place. And then there's some regional mail order places that where they're actually growing plants in this region. So that in turn, when we're talking about the genetic pool, the gene pool of these plants, it's nice to stick with regionally grown plants as opposed to ordering from Oregon, the upper Midwest. So we've got some in Missouri and some in Kansas, and those, some of the resources that I put on that last slide have will help you not only pick out the plants that are good for your area, but are also grown locally, at least Kansas regional area. Yes, I can just see that in the chat that Dennis has put up the Deep Roots local native plant organization.
Yeah, good resources there. Some questions, a couple questions had come through about transplanting or kind of, digging, dividing natives that we may already have. Is that possible? Plants like woodland phlox or verbena were mentioned, or are there other plants that are good to transplant, move, or spread?
Yes, a lot of them can be. So like rose verbena you mentioned, that's a great one you can pick up and put somewhere else. And it tends to do that on its own as well. But you can actually do that one. Talk to your local horticulture agent about their individual experiences. There are some that are going to be really tough. Like one that's very difficult is that butterfly milkweed. It's got a really big taproot, and that's going to be something that's going to be really difficult to transplant. Is something with and that of course, that's one of the advantages, of course, of having native plants. There's those root systems. They help with water infiltration into the soil. They help improve our soil conditions, but it can make it hard to transplant some of them. The rosinweed that I mentioned. So take a clue maybe from your neighbors, your friends that have experience with native plants, if they tried to transplant them. Like I said, that rosinweed pops up all over the place. So if you see it popping up, it's probably something you can dig up, repot, give it to a neighbor, or transplant. Rose verbena is another one, but something like the Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed with that big giant taproot, that's going to be much more difficult.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so this is a follow-up to that question on seeds and starting plants from seeds or harvesting seeds. Can you talk about that? Is it possible to save money if we start our own plants from seeds? Is that an easy process, or maybe just guide that a little bit? Yeah.
Well, I've done a whole sort of series on starting plants from seed, and yes, it is possible. But the thing about the native wildflower seeds is most of them need some kind of preparation to break dormancy. And most of them need what's called cold moist stratification. And that's just a word for, basically, if you think about when plants release their seeds in the fall, they're going to sit on the ground all winter, and they go through that freeze thaw all over winter, and then they're able to germinate in the spring. Those plants require that freezing and thawing to break dormancy. So if you're going to start plants by seed, you need to basically artificially give that plant that. If you're going to collect seed, and a word about collecting seed, it's a great way if you can collect seed from your own plants. But I do caution people, don't go out to the parks or to other public land and collect seeds from the local prairies. You do need to ask permission if you're going to do that. But you can collect from friends, you can collect from your own native seeds, but you need to give it that stratification. So one way to do that is you can do the old milk jug. If people are familiar with put some potting soil, moisten potting soil, and put those seeds out in the elements over winter, and allowing them to freeze and thaw. You can put them in a garden bed and allow them to freeze and thaw over the winter, and then germinate in the spring, and then transplant them from your garden bed, from the milk jug. So you can do that. So that's just a short answer to trying to start from seed.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, get us a good start there. So as far as some of the other questions, we have a question on yarrow, and specifically on maybe dividing that or transplanting. Have you any experience with the yarrow?
Yes, I have transplanted yarrow, and yarrow is one of those things that's a very common one that's available. and a lot of garden centers as well. Not only the straight native one, but also all kinds of varieties and colors that yarrow comes in. But I've had, well, it would have been successful transplanting the yarrow had I cared for a little more. One thing, you still, whenever you transplant or start something from seed, you do have to water it in. So when I say less water, that means after it's established. So I transplanted my yarrow and then forgot about it. And so it would have done well had I given it a little more care at the start, and then it would have been fine on its own. And I wouldn't have to worry about it.
Excellent. Well, I think we're just right here almost at 1 o'clock. So we're going to wrap up. Appreciate all the questions, and yeah, check out the resources when this is posted.
Thank you.
Yes, Sharon, thank you for all that information. We do need to cut you short here on just a few questions, but I think we got most of them answered today. Once again, thank you for joining us for the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are glad you could be here today to learn about integrating native plants into your home landscapes. There are several interesting sessions coming up. Join us on September 6th to learn about seed saving from your garden. Be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website to see all of the upcoming topics, or to go back and watch anything that we have previously done. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series from the K-State Garden Hour website. This session was recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out, as we would greatly appreciate any and all feedback you can give us. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you on September 6th. Have a great rest of your week.